This session, as people would be aware, is on Council's financial statements for the 21 financial year or 2021 financial year, and to provide the community and those that are attending with an update on Council's financial position. Just before we get underway, just a few housekeeping matters. And that's firstly, this session is being recorded. It will be made available on Council's website within the next 2 to 3 days. All participants' microphones will be muted through the sessions. If you are participating via a computer or a smart device, you can, however, use the chat function to submit a question. We will compile the questions and answer them in groups at the end of the presentation. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to the ancestors, spirits, past and present. I would also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to any Aboriginal persons joining us today. My name is Ken Goldthorpe. For those that I haven't met, I'm the General Manager at North Sydney Council, and this is my fourth or third financial year, end of my fourth year here at Council. I'm joined tonight by Margaret Palmer. Margaret is the Director of Corporate Services and effectively fulfills the Chief Financial Officer function here at Council, as well as being responsible for the broader range of corporate services departments within the organisation. As I stated before, the purpose of today's session is to provide an overview of Council's financial position as at the end of the 2021 financial year, and it also provides an opportunity for attendees to put questions directly to us, and we will attempt to answer those as best we can. I do note that some people supplied questions in advance of tonight's presentation, and we will address those questions at the end. Although hopefully you will see some of the answers to those come through the presentation itself. To start with, as a summary, before I hand over to Margaret, who will work through the statements in more detail, I have to say that Council has had a very sound financial year, and that's despite the challenges of the pandemic. After a significant operating loss before capital grants and contributions of $11.5 million in the 2019-20 financial year, largely as a result of COVID-19, operating revenues and expenses have now returned to a relatively balanced position. In the last financial year, prior to capital grants and contributions, Council suffered a $0.5 million loss, which as a percentage of our total revenues of in the order of $140 million is pretty close to a balanced budget. The change from the previous financial year, in part, is attributable to the initial early recovery from the COVID pandemic in the second half of the financial year, prior to the Delta variant outbreak, which again locked down Sydney. And it was also partly due to cost control measures that were implemented as part of Council's response after the first year or first 8 to 9 months of the pandemic. On the positive side, Council has also maximised the opportunities available from capital funding programs from other government sources. And as a response to the economic situation brought forward by the COVID pandemic, there was significantly more grant opportunities available, particularly from the federal government over the past 12 months. As a result of that, our net operating result after capital grants and contributions, which flows on to community equity, was $23.7 million. So community equity increased by $23.7 million over the last financial year, which was a $28.8 million improvement on the preceding financial year. We move on to the agenda. Sorry, we're just having a problem moving on with the presentation. Margaret, I think it's because you've got to put that, use your mouse and just close down, just hit that button. Okay. Now good try. Sorry, everybody, we'll just need our IT people to help us. Unfortunately, the presentation seems to have just frozen temporarily.
Oh, that's weird enough. Oh, okay.
Can you move it forward now?
Yes.
Okay.
Action.
So the more detailed agenda for tonight's presentation, as I said, Margaret will go through this in detail, and then I'll provide a summary at the end and address any of the questions. But effectively, the presentation from Margaret is broken down into three parts. Firstly, looking at Council's financial position as at 30th of June. That includes a comparison and breakdown of our income and expenditure statement. It looks at our capital expenditure. It also looks specifically at the special rate variation and the year 2 expenditure report, so where the special rate variation funds were applied to. The second part is looking at performance measures as at 30th of June 21, which goes through a range of ratios, and these are the ratios which we report back to the Office of Local Government on each year, and really gives an overview of Council's financial sustainability and overall financial position. And then we'll wrap up with a financial summary of the operating result, which I've already given a brief summary of, and the net operating result and the comparison over a 5-year period, and then finish off with any questions. So Margaret, it's all yours.
Thank you. As the GM has just said, that it's been I think it's fair to say it's been a very positive year despite the impact of COVID on, which could have been a lot worse on our financials. But I think that one of the pleasing things is that besides ending the year in a much stronger financial position across a number of measures, which we will go into, is the fact that we also had some very positive comments and a very clean review and audit results from the external auditors. And I think that was very pleasing, because I think what's really important to the community is to know that there's good governance and good review over the financial information that we provide to the community in our annual report that we'll be talking about tonight, not only from a very, very good external review, but also from, as the GM was saying earlier on, through the number of ratios that we have to report to the Office of Local Government. So I think I just wanted to mention that besides these results, we've also got a very strong governance around the accuracy and the integrity of the numbers that we do bring to you. So the first slide I'm going to go through is it's essentially a summary of the the financial state of the organisations across a number of things. So in most areas we've improved. So in the total assets are in a lot stronger position and have increased from 98 million to 122. Our total liabilities, they have risen somewhat, but not hugely. Our total net current assets have been, so we're holding, our assets are obviously the value to the organisation, they've increased marginally, and our total non-current liabilities have decreased. So when I'm talking about current assets and current liabilities, I'm talking about the short term within the 1 year, whereas the non-current are more spread over many, many years. I think the most pleasing thing is the total equity, which essentially is the value of the organisation, has increased to 1274 over the 1233. So in all ways that's improved. Our cash and investments are also stronger, and we really did benefit in this area from even with COVID hitting, and also the the financial impact on the economy, we've benefited because a lot of our investments have been held in quite long-term investments, and we've got a really strong and very well balanced portfolio of investments and very strong cash flow, which I'll go into later as well. And You may or may not be aware that we have external and internally restricted funds. These externally restricted funds are funds that the organisation is holding that are actually tied to projects. The council is not free to do what it wants to do with those funds, and they are tightly monitored and tightly controlled and tightly audited. And we do have internally restricted funds, which are essentially deployed to facilitate decisions of council and other programmes of work, in particular capital works programme. There's also, in terms of that, there were some benefits in terms of the capital works projects and the redevelopment of this North Sydney Olympic pool. So essentially, overall, this slide is really a summary of where we are at council, and it's a very strong statement of the financial stability of the organisation and why we're able to also fund some of the big projects that we have. But I will be talking later about the SRV. So moving on to a more detailed look at this. The next slide is basically about our income, and it's a comparison over the last 2 years. And as you will see from the slide, again, our income from continuing operations across a number of areas is being strong, and it's 18.3 higher than last year. So our rates and annual charges, which are at 66 million, increased by 33.1 million, which is 4.9% in 2020-21. And that was to do with the fact that we gained a partial special rate variation. And also we had some increases in general, well, that gave us some increases in general rates for this year, and also for last year to some extent. User charges and fees, also revenue increased by, was 31.2 million, increased by 2.9 million, which is 10.2% in 2020-21. This was basically due to an increase in statutory regulatory fees of approximately 2 million. And also there was a delay in, as you may or may not be aware, of the commencement of the North Sydney Olympic pool, which meant that the flow-on effect to that additional income coming in has also contributed to the increase overall in income generated for 20 and 21 over last financial year. Also want to mention grants and contributions revenue of 29.7 million, and that increased by 17.3 million over the previous year. Most notable, and that was a receipt of developer contributions, 11.8 million from the Sydney Metro. So that was good because that came in advance. So that's, again, I feel like I'm just telling happy stories here, but it has been predominantly a happy year. Moving on to the expenditure side, the expenditure across this year and last year was basically stable. So there wasn't any major fluctuations, but it was noticeable that there's a change, a variation of 5.2%. But it is worth noting that through COVID, we carefully managed, obviously, the finance side of things, the expenditure side of things, and we had a decrease in employee benefits and other expenses. So one of the strategies that the GM deployed was we had a recruitment freeze for obvious reasons. I mean, people couldn't come into the office and, you can't onboard new people, but that really helped us manage and offset some of the expense. So that was also a positive over the previous year in terms of we've spent less, I guess is what I'm saying, this year over last year. Just move on. The capital expenditure. And so this is basically a benchmark of the council strategic asset management. and it's a way of assessing the rate at which the council's assets are being renewed against the rate to which they're depreciating. And so that needs to be managed very carefully. The asset renewals for 2021 were carried out in accordance with the council's capital works programme and primarily related to road and footpath assets. Again, there's a strategic plan for this. During 2021, 32.2 million was spent on capital projects. 24.5 million was spent on renewal of existing infrastructure, property, plant and equipment, compared to 26.1 million in the comparative prior year of 2019-20. 7.6 million was spent on the acquisition of new infrastructure, property, plant and equipment. 75,000 was spent on refurbishing of investment properties. And in 2021 as well, infrastructure asset renewals of 24.5 million represented 94% of the council's 26 million depreciation expense. So essentially, one of the main expenses for the council, besides obviously salaries and a few other things, is being, in terms of operating, has been the depreciation on our assets. And the result was higher than 2019. And that's the story of our capital state and affairs. Now, I think this next slide's important because this is about the cash that we have over periods of time, and cash management being very important to the council. So the council reported an increase in cash from 9.2 million on the 30th of June 20 to 25.2 million in the same period, 30th of June 2021. So the cash inflows from operating activities increased from 32.8 million in the prior years of 2019-20 to 52.8 million in the current year. So you can see on the cash reserves strong. That was to do with higher receipts in user charges and fees, grants and contributions. And as the GM said earlier, we did benefit from a lot of grants this financial year. Cash outflows, this is money going out from investment activities, decreased marginally from 36.6 million in the prior year of 2019-20 to 35.7 million in the current year. Also, the cash flows from finance activities remain pretty stable. So the cash management and the cash holdings have been very stable and strong over a period of time. We'll go to the next slide. So as you know, we were successful, the council was successful in getting a partial SRB. And so that was over a 3-year period. So that happened on the 14th of May 2019. We advised. So that it meant that the council could increase both residential and business rates by 7% per annum, inclusive of the rate peg, for 3 years, which is we're in essentially our last year of that SRV. It ends on the 30th of June 2022. So the additional revenues enabled the council to maintain existing service levels, including the services to the community such as verge mowing, graffiti removal, precinct management. Plus it's generated 11.9 million total additional funds over the 3 years, and an addition of 7.3 million to address the condition, which is one of the reasons we got the SRV, was actually about the conditions of assets. So we've been able to address some of the very poor assets and also the remaining funds to undertake some additional capital works. And so St Leonard's Park Master Plan, which you'd be familiar with, the public domain upgrades in Neutral Bay, Cremorne, Kirribilli and McMahon Point villages, the playground upgrade in Cyrus Street Reserve and Grasmere Children's Park, and walking trails in the Primrose Park and Gore Cove to Smoothy Park. So I will say that what did come through in the obvious when we were going through the audit and having a look at through all our financial results is that had we not had that SRV, the state of our asset renewals would have been quite concerning. So I think that the financial results in the annual report does justify going to get that SRV. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to the next section of the slides, which is really about performance ratios. And I spoke earlier on about governance over our financial, if you like, status. And this is these ratios can be used very well to highlight whether there are any problems emerging through our financial results, and indeed are used by the Office of Local Government to really watch and make sure that each council is actually managing well. So the operating performance ratio, this measures how well the council's contained its operational expenditure within the operating revenue. So I spoke earlier about our income and our expenditure. This is a ratio that has been devised to measure that. The benchmark set by OLG is greater than 0%, and the council has met that benchmark for the current reporting period, and the ratio is stabilised in the current year as compared to an unusual result in prior years, reflecting a greater reduction in grant funding. So the grant funding that we've received has really helped to stabilise this ratio, and we've also in there as well as reflected the COVID-19 impact and some high depreciation costs to do with the North Sydney Olympic Pool. But this is, we have recovered from the previous financial year, which was a bit of a blip. Not that I'm making light of it, but it was an unusual situation in 2020.
Margaret, if I could just add there, I think what everyone will see as we go through these performance ratios and then the summary slide is just what the trend has been and what the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been. And we can briefly talk about what we're likely to see in the next 12 months. So Council has traditionally operated on small operating surpluses to supplement Council's capital works program. In 2020 financial year, we did suffer a significant loss before capital grants and contributions, largely as a result of significantly reduced revenues that came with the reduced activity that we saw through the CBD, in particular with car parking reduced and a whole raft of other charges that flowed on to less use of our parks, less use of our sporting facilities. So our user fees and charges dropped substantially. Council's overall revenue mix is made up of just under 50% of our revenue comes from fixed rates and charges through the rates bill, and over 50% still comes from direct user fees and charges. So they were impacted severely when we went through the major lockdowns in the early parts of COVID-19, and that led to the result that you're seeing there on that ratio and the loss that was suffered in the 2019-20 financial year. As I said before, we were able to address that in 2020-21, partly because of the return to or the significant return that the economy made after the original lockdown and before the Delta strain impacted, and also partly due to the response the council put in place with reducing its expenditure and in particular reducing its salary and wage costs. Unfortunately, I'm expecting that we will actually move back into negative territory in the current financial year as a result of the longer term lockdown following the Delta strain that's impacted on the first half of the 22 financial year. But we'll obviously have more about that as we do our budget reviews during this financial year and come back and report to the community further.
Thank you, GM. Moving on now to our own source operating revenue ratio. This measures the council's fiscal flexibility and the degree to which it relies on external funding sources such as operating grants and contributions. So the benchmark set by the local government office is 60%. The council's exceeded that benchmark for the past 3 years. The ratio reflects the council has a greater reliance on its own source of funds, rates and annual charges and user charges and fees, and that's a good story as well, because it means that we aren't totally dependent on external funds.
And that's a ratio that really affects largely regional communities in particular. North Sydney Council gets very limited what we call FAGS grants, or financial assistance grants, from the federal government as a proportion of our overall revenue. Most of our revenues is own source revenue. It comes from our own rates and charges and our own user charges and fees. In remote communities, you often find that their component of revenue is made up much larger portions of federal funding and or state funding, and their ratios tend to be much lower. So that exceeding this benchmark is quite common for metropolitan councils. It's much more of a challenge for regional and remote communities.
Thank you. We're now moving on to the unrestricted current ratio. It's specific to local government and represents council's ability to meet its short-term obligations as they fall due. So the benchmark set by OLG is 1.5 times, and the council's exceeded that benchmark as well for the last 3 years. The ratio indicates the council currently has $2.82 of unrestricted current assets available to service every dollar of its unrestricted current liabilities. That was also reflected in our balance sheet that I was speaking about earlier on. I should say the financial summary I was speaking about earlier on. I may have something to say about the debt services cover ratio. This measures the operating cash to service debt, including interest, principal and lease payments. Benchmark set at 2 times. The council's exceeded this for the last 3 years. The council appears to be effectively monitoring its liquidity levels to ensure it could meet its borrowing costs when they fall due. And this was an interesting question during COVID with regards to rates and the levying of rates, and what would happen in terms of the whether we would have a lot of outstanding non-payment of rates due to COVID.
I think the other thing that was important with our cash management and debt service ratios during COVID is there were significant delays placed on a range of council revenues. So there was an extension for people's capacity to pay their rates in the early parts of COVID. There were also a number of concessions that the state government applied to the development sector on the timing of when they paid their contributions. And all of those things combined, that and the fact that we were seeing significantly less activity and therefore less revenue from activity, all effectively had a cash impact on council. Fortunately, as you saw, we hold reasonable cash reserves. When you look at what's restricted and unrestricted, the amount that we actually have available to use at our discretion is still reasonably limited. But council was able to cover those issues that arose as part of our cash flow management during COVID-19.
Thank you. And this ratio is specific to rates and annual charges outstanding, and there's been a lot of work done on processes around collection of rates and debts. So rates and annual charges outstanding percentage. So the benchmark set for that was 5%, and we've exceeded that for the last 3 years. And the ratio has been impacted primarily by economic conditions resulting from COVID-19. However, that has still been a better result in 2021, and that's a reflection of the way in which we are going about collecting our rates and managing that whole process. And we've got a cash expense cover ratio next. This is all about liquidity, and it indicates the number of months the council continue its operations without any cash flow coming in. 3 months is the benchmark set by the OLG, and we, for the past 3 years, we've exceeded that. We can survive for, roughly speaking, 11.5 months on that, if that did happen and we didn't have any cash. So that's far in excess of the period that the OLG have set. And I would like to hand over or hand back to our GM to do a summary.
Sure. Has it gone back to the beginning? I think you're moving on to the other side.
I think this is it.
Okay, thank you.
Well, it could have, anything could happen, you never know with this technology. This mouse is out of control.
Perhaps if I could just grab that for a second. As Margaret has said, we've seen a positive result from this financial year. We did see an increase in our total income from continuing operations, inclusive of capital grants and programs. A lot of work was put in by staff throughout the year, and I have to acknowledge the directors within the organisation and the management team. We were vigilant in trying to take advantage of any additional grant funding source, and the significant upturn in our financial results during the 2021 financial year was largely a reflection of several matters, as we've spoken about before. That was the upturn that we saw in the economy from the move back to normality before the second Delta break lockdown, the second wave. It was also as a result from the mitigation measures that the organisation put in place to reduce expenses after the outbreak of COVID. But thirdly, in the 2021 financial year, it was also through taking the advantage of the funding programs that became available from the state and federal government and utilising those for capital programs. And that was what led to the $28 million improvement in Council's overall net position, including capital grants and contributions, which flowed on to an improvement in the community equity. The other positive result that we saw in 2019-20 that I'll highlight in this slide is the transition back from the $11.5 million loss on continuing operations in 2019-20. That is the continuing operations excluding capital grants and contributions, to a relatively balanced position with a loss of $0.5 million in 2021. At that particular time, we were looking forward to a quick upturn and move back into surplus in the 21-22 financial year. So we were looking very positive. And as I've mentioned, the subsequent lockdown during the first half of this financial year following the Delta outbreak has certainly had an impact on that, and that will flow through to this year's financial accounts. Margaret, if you could flick on to the next slide.
Of course.
Thank you. This slide shows that operating result, and this is the operating result before capital grants and contributions. And as you can see there, for the 3 financial years, 2017 to 2019, you can see the council continued to maintain a surplus of around the $5 million mark, plus or minus a small amount, which is what we aim to do. That $5 million surplus on operating account then becomes leads into council's capacity to leverage grants by being able to put forward our portion of the funding, attract grants from other sources to leverage up the amount of money that we can apply to capital expenditure. It also goes to funds that we can apply to the renewal program. And that, as per the introduction of the SRB 3 years ago, we've very much had a focus on bringing our infrastructure assets up to a high standard of condition. And that program that's now been in place, we're getting towards the the middle of the third year of operation has certainly reduced the infrastructure backlog. I remember 3 years ago we had a number of stairways closed off. We had a number of wharfs down along the harbour front that were closed off because they need significant work underneath the wharfs, and those have now all been addressed and are all open. And you can see there the significant downturn in the 2019-20 financial year, and the move back to the relatively balanced position in the 2021 financial year. There is an error there. That should be a loss of 0.5 million, not a surplus of 0.5 million. I apologise for that in the slide. If we move on to the next slide, this actually shows the impact on community equity, and this is a positive story. You can see there that the net operating result after capital grants and contributions effectively demonstrates whether we're increasing the value of community assets and community to the community and the facilities that we're able to provide. And you can see there consistently through the last 5 years that Council has been able to increase and improve community equity, with the exception of 2019-20 as a result of COVID-19. I think in coming to a conclusion, and we'll move on to address a few of the questions, but again, I'll just summarise by saying that 2021 was a good financial year. It did mark the return to a balanced position on our continuing operations. It moved us into a surplus position after capital grants and contributions, and a positive input to community equity. As far as questions are concerned, if anyone has any further questions, and I can see a couple flowing through on the chat, please feel free to put them up. Some of the questions that we had in advance of tonight's meeting, or two of those questions, relate to the North Sydney Olympic Pool and our progress on budget with the pool. I have to say it's been a very challenging, very challenging period of time in respect to doing any construction activity. Council had to, like most constructing organisations, had to close down a whole raft of projects for a short period of time following the Delta outbreak. That included the North Sydney Olympic Pool, but it also included the range of pavement type projects we were doing through Neutral Bay, projects down with the shared zone and the 40 kilometre hour speed limits down at Kirribilli and Marks, down near Blues Point, and it also impacted on the construction works happening through a range of parks and the implementation of the St Leonard's master plan down near North Sydney Oval. In respect to the North Sydney Olympic Pool, it did result in the contractor having to close down their site for a period of just over 2 weeks. That will have a flow through on the delivery time for the project, so that does create a slight delay in the anticipated reopening time for the pool. Overall, on the budget, we are travelling very well as in fact, probably better than I could have expected. We've now completed all of the demolition, and most of the high-risk area in regard to the redevelopment of North Sydney Olympic Pool was actually in the demolition. In particular, we were concerned with the excavation. The way that project was planned, we were not able to undertake a geo-survey work across the entirety of the site. And that was largely because we were trying to keep the pools open. The only way of doing geo-survey work in some areas of the site would have required us to effectively drill a hole right through the middle of the swimming pools, which of course we couldn't do and keep them open. So it wasn't until we closed the pool and commenced the project that we were able to do that geo-survey work and get greater certainty around what we would need to extract from underneath some of the very old structures of the pool. The entire project budget is $64 million. That includes the contract value for the contract company, and within their contract value includes provisional sums on some aspects, on a small portion, it's around 10% of the entire construction cost of the project, but there were provisional sums in relation to some of the unknowns, including the removal of soil and the potential for contaminated soil and the need to treat contaminated soil. The other thing through the demolition, we did find, in particular, a significant more portions of asbestos than we expected, and in some places that we certainly didn't expect. So, for example, asbestos was used in the grouting in the tiles, between the tiles in the main outdoor pool, which was particularly challenging in how we removed that and minimised the cost of getting rid of the old product, separating it from the tiles in order to reduce our overall disposal costs. But notwithstanding that, we've managed to achieve that result, or achieve the demolition within the provisional sums that we allowed for. So the project is progressing very well. We also have an amount of money for contingencies for the project in the way it's been established, which is normal for any construction project, and we're still operating well within our contingency limit. So at this stage, we're looking pretty, we're reasonably confident and certainly happy with the progress that has been achieved to date. The other questions that we have, there's a question here regarding financial information, and in particular, it seeks to know whether every council, whether the cost of every individual project is available to ratepayers. Council reports under the Australian accounting standards, which of course pool a lot of that information. But I would direct people that are more interested in delving deeper into the council's accounts to another range of source documentation. A lot of the material is available through the information that feeds into council's budgets. So every year, council updates its delivery program. Its delivery program is a schedule of works that council intends to undertake and budgets for in its longer term financial plan for the full 4-year term of council. And then every year we do an operational plan and budget, which looks at in more detail at the 12 months ahead on a financial year basis. So for those people that wish to see more detail, I'd refer you to the delivery program and operating budget, which is available on council's website. Also, if you wish to go even further, if you go and investigate the asset management plans, the council holds or is responsible for managing approximately $1.2 billion in infrastructure assets on behalf of the community. And we have detailed asset management plans broken down by approximately 6 asset classes, which identifies on a project by project basis each of the projects that we aim to deliver in order to maintain our existing our assets over their full life. So I'll refer you to those documents. We've had a further question on verge mowing, and I know this one came out of the special rate variation. One of our attendees has raised the question about the special rate variation helps to maintain verge mowing, and that they would have thought that that was an essential service. Verge mowing is actually something that most local governments don't do. North Sydney Council is one of the very few councils that actually undertakes mowing on the verges throughout the local government area. It's a service that I think really the council needs to continue. It's a service like our refuse pickup service, where we supply significantly more curbside pickups, bulk waste pickups, than what most local governments do. And those services, I think, really reflect the density of development that we have through North Sydney, the fact that we're an inner city metropolitan council. As a result of that, it is actually quite cost effective for us to, in bulk, mow verges and keep the place looking much more uniform and in good condition. It takes some of the requirement off of either corporate bodies or property owners to mow their own verges, which is a standard throughout New South Wales and throughout Australia. And again, the refuse pickup as well means that people don't have to own trailers or aren't expected to take their own bulk waste to landfill facilities, which of course aren't readily available in the inner metropolitan area anyway. The SRV doesn't per se fund verge mowing. Where the connection is, I believe, was to the discussion around whether or not council needed a special rate variation when it was introduced 2.5 years ago. And the issue that we have that all local governments have is that under the rate capping process that applies, often the increases that we're capped, our revenues is capped at, does not keep up with inflation, and therefore over time often doesn't allow council to be able to maintain the increasing number of assets that it's responsible for. The other thing with the rate capping approach that's applied by the state government is that's based on our historical costs of maintaining our assets. And of course, each year council inherits additional assets. Some we inherit or create ourselves, and the coal loader is a very good example of that. It's a very good facility for the community, but council expended around $27 million, I believe, in redeveloping the coal loader, and thereafter is responsible for maintaining it. So we have to find the extra money each year to be able to maintain it once we've built that asset. And the assets that we either inherit from the development sector or create as we upgrade and renew and further development occurs also have to be maintained going forward. And that was why the special rate variation was required. It was required in order to increase the funds that council had to put towards renewing and maintaining its assets and to prevent them from deteriorating over time. There's a range of other questions coming through. Just hold on for a moment. I'll just have a look through the chat and see what we can address.
I can speak to the. There's a question here as well. 2019-20 significant losses over 11 million, but COVID did not hit Australia until the final quarter of 19-20, and the federal paid the JobKeeper money. So how were we in a loss situation 2019-20, especially as 2021 year grant money 29. One of the things that I meant to mention actually as we were going through the presentation is the 1920 was impacted there was a couple of accounting transactions that took place that were non-cash items, one of which was to do with depreciation and bring into account the useful life of the North Sydney Olympic Pool assets. So we had quite a significant write-off of depreciation in that year, even though, which was hotly debated at our ARIC meeting, it was felt best that we should address that. So that was a non-cash item, and it was also impacted by revaluations of some assets and the fair value. So there were a number of non-cash items that did impact on that financial year's results, rather than a systemic issue about cash coming in or anything of that nature.
And look, Margaret, I'll just add to that. So just for those, well, I presume most people watching are actually able to see the chat section.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So, the chat area and realise the question that we're answering. So the question effectively is, how did we suffer a significant loss of $11 million in the 2019-20 year and on the basis that COVID did not hit Australia until the final quarter of 1920. COVID hit in March, the beginning of March 2020, so the full quarter, or 25% of the financial year. And when it first hit, it did have a significant impact. You might recall that we went into a significant lockdown. We had to close a number of our facilities. Our library closed, North Sydney Olympic Pool closed early. We closed the North Sydney Oval and a whole range of our facilities, coal loader. And the lockdown had a significant impact on our rents received from our property portfolio. Our car parking fees in particular were significantly reduced as people were moved to working from home. And there's also the comment there about JobKeeper. Our local government was not able to access the federal government JobKeeper program. We were specifically excluded from that. So the JobKeeper program did not assist local government at all. We were required to meet our own costs associated with the staff that had to be stood down. As you saw leading into the 2021 financial statements, we did reduce our overall salary and labour costs, but that took time to put in place. We did receive some support from the state government, but it was significantly less attractive than what the federal government JobKeeper program was, and required council to meet its own losses or costs associated with staff not being able to attend work for a significant period of time. If we move on to one of the further questions, and thank you to the individual that's passed on their congratulations to council's financial management, and we particularly in those tough times. I greatly appreciate that, and I'm sure Margaret and her team do as well. In regard to the question about revenue from parking fines and from DAs, there seems to be an increasing building works in the North Sydney local government area. How does this impact on revenue projections for North Sydney Council? The reality of it is council's finance are closely associated with the development sector, particularly historically for infrastructure grants and infrastructure contributions. Also, a lot of our revenues associated with hoardings, a whole range of development application charges themselves, and a whole range of other things really relates to the amount of development activity that's occurring through the local government area. So certainly the increase in development and construction works does have a flow through on our revenues. It also addresses our expenditures though, because obviously we then need the staff or the contractors to carry out the development assessments, to undertake a lot of the compliance work associated with development and construction, and to address the invariable complaints and issues that arise throughout construction that we see in this very densely populated area, where we have large unit blocks and residential apartments in very close proximity to major developments like the metros. But overall, development activity has a positive impact on council's revenues. There is another comment there about verge mowing. I'll take that as a statement. I don't think it's anything further that we can add to that, other than I have to point out that verge mowing is a service that is certainly supported by council. We're very lucky in a lot of ways to live in the North Sydney area. I think everyone appreciates the environment, and the lower North Shore, and North Sydney in particular, is an area that's highly sought after. We always receive very positive comments in regard to the green amenity of the area, the street trees, the high quality and condition in which the parks and public spaces are maintained. And I think verge mowing is part of that. It ensures that we get a level of consistency in the maintenance of the street. It means that a lot of people don't necessarily have to own a lawnmower themselves. And you know, my view is it's a service that's appropriate for a council in a metropolitan area like ours to take on. But of course, it does come at a cost, which we have to meet. I think that's addressed practically all of the questions. I also think we're coming very close to the end of the allotted time. So I would like to thank everyone for their attendance this evening. I hope you found that information informative. As at the beginning of tonight's session, the webcast of this or the recording of this will be placed on Council's website in the coming days for those that were unable to attend during the scheduled session but might wish to review it, all of it or part of it at their own convenience. If you do have any further questions following tonight's presentation, please email your questions to yoursay@northsydney.nsw.gov.au, which you'll find on your website, and council staff will endeavour to provide you with a prompt response. And thank you very much again for your interest. Good night.
Good night.